I never planned to pretend to be anything other than myself, but life has a way of teaching you when silence is safer than explanation. By the time my son Daniel told me he wanted me to meet his wife's family, I already knew what role I would play. Not because he asked me to, and not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because experience had taught me how people listen differently when they think you have nothing to offer. Daniel is my only child. I raised him alone after his father passed when Daniel was just 6. There was no dramatic inheritance, no insurance miracle, just a small apartment, a sewing machine, and my determination to make sure my son never felt the weight of our lack. I worked quietly, saved quietly, and lived quietly. Over time, that quiet turned into stability, and that stability turned into something comfortable. But comfort, I learned, is best worn lightly. When Daniel married Claire, I could see immediately that she came from a different world. She was kind, yes, but polished in a way that comes from never having to question whether the lights would stay on. Her parents lived in a large house just outside the city, the kind with long driveways and trimmed hedges that look like they've never known dust. They spoke easily about vacations, renovations, and investments. Not once did they ask where I lived or how I spent my days, and I noticed that too. When the invitation came to visit them for dinner, Daniel sounded nervous in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy asking permission to attend his first school trip. He told me they were very proper people. That word alone told me everything. I smiled into the phone and told him not to worry, I would come as I always did. On the day of the visit, I chose my simplest dress. It was clean, ironed, and modest, but old. I wore shoes I'd had for years and left my watch at home. I tied my hair back plainly and carried no handbag, just a small cloth purse. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a lie. I saw a version of myself the world had once believed without question. Their home was as expected. Claire's mother greeted us with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her father shook my hand briefly, already turning back toward Daniel as if I were a passing formality. The house smelled like polished wood and expensive candles. Everything gleamed, including the expectations hanging silently in the air. At dinner, they asked questions, but not really to hear the answers. Claire's mother asked where I lived, and when I told her a small place near the old market, she nodded slowly, the way people do when they've already decided what that means. Her father asked what I did for work. I told him I sewed, did alterations, and helped where I could. He smiled thinly and said, "Oh, that's practical." No one asked about Daniel's childhood. No one asked how I raised him alone. They spoke instead about the wedding expenses, about how generous they had been, about the guest list and the venue. I listened, I smiled, I thanked them for including me. I noticed how Claire's younger brother smirked when I declined wine and asked for water instead. I acted naive. I asked simple questions about their home, about the paintings on the wall. I praised things I knew were expensive as if I had never seen such beauty before. And as I did, something shifted. They relaxed. Their shoulders loosened. They spoke more freely, more carelessly. When people think you are small, they stop guarding their words. Claire's mother mentioned almost casually that they hoped Daniel would be ambitious enough to keep up with their family standards. Her father joked about how love was important, but security was more important. They laughed, and I laughed too, softly, as if I agreed. Daniel sat stiffly beside me, his jaw tight. I could feel his discomfort, but I placed my hand gently over his knee under the table. This was not the moment for defense. This was the moment for listening. As dessert was served, Claire's father leaned back and said something that made the room feel colder. He said he was glad Daniel had married into a family that could guide him properly, since not everyone was raised with the same advantages. His eyes flicked toward me briefly, then away. I felt no anger, only clarity. I had seen this before. People mistake humility for ignorance. They confuse quiet for weakness, and in that confusion they reveal their truest selves. When we left that evening, Daniel apologized over and over. He said he hadn't realized how they would speak, how they would look at me. I told him gently that there was nothing to apologize for. I had learned everything I needed to know. What I didn't tell him was that their assumptions were already unraveling in my mind, that the stories they told, the hints they dropped, the pride they displayed, it all pointed towards something they believed was hidden, something they never imagined someone like me could understand. As we drove home, Daniel asked me if I was hurt. I told him the truth. I wasn't hurt. I was patient. Because when people show you who they are, the next step is deciding who you will be to them in return. And I had already decided that the next time I saw Claire's family, I wouldn't need to pretend at all. Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth, when revealed at the right moment, carries a weight no performance ever could. The days after that dinner passed quietly, but my mind was busy. I replayed every word, every glance, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. I had spent most of my life learning how to read between silences. When you raise a child alone, you learn quickly that what is not said often matters more than what is. Claire's parents had spoken plenty that night, and in their comfort, they had revealed more than they realized. Daniel called me often that week. He was unsettled, torn between loyalty to his wife and concern for me. I could hear the strain in his voice when he mentioned how Claire's parents were already discussing future plans for them. Bigger house, better neighborhood, expectations wrapped in smiles. He asked me gently if I thought they looked down on me. I told him something my own mother once told me. People only look down when they are afraid of what they don't understand. I did not tell him about the quiet conclusions I had drawn. I did not tell him that when Claire's father spoke about security and guidance, he sounded less like a man offering support and more like one calculating leverage. Nor did I mention that when Claire's mother talked about generosity, her eyes lingered on Daniel as if he were an investment they expected returns from. A week later, Claire called me herself. Her voice was sweet, careful, almost rehearsed. She said her parents wanted to host another dinner, something more relaxed, just family. She emphasized that they wanted to get to know me better. I smiled into the phone and agreed. I told her I would bring something homemade. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hear the surprise she tried to hide. That evening, as I prepared a simple dish, my phone buzzed with a message from an old acquaintance. It was brief, but it confirmed something I had already suspected. Claire's father had been involved in a business venture that was not as successful as he liked people to believe. In fact, it was struggling, quietly, desperately, the kind of struggle hidden behind polished surfaces and confident laughter. I did not seek this information out of malice. It came to me the way truth often does, when you are patient enough to let it arrive on its own. And when it did, I understood why they were so concerned with Daniel's ambition, with control, with ensuring he stayed within their influence. They were not guiding him, they were positioning him. At the second dinner, I arrived dressed the same way I had before, simple, modest, unassuming. Claire's mother greeted me more warmly this time, offering compliments that felt a little forced. Her father asked more questions, but now there was a sharpness behind them. He wanted to know how Daniel planned to advance in his career, whether he was open to opportunities through family connections. Daniel glanced at me once, uncertain, and I nodded gently for him to speak freely. I listened as they spoke of partnerships, of shared futures, of how families should support one another. They spoke of trust, and then, carefully, Claire's father mentioned a potential investment opportunity. Something small, he said, just to get Daniel involved, just to build experience. I asked a question then, softly. I asked what kind of investment it was. The table went quiet. Claire's father laughed lightly and said it was complicated, nothing I needed to worry about. He said it kindly, the way one speaks to a child or an elder they believe is incapable of understanding numbers. That was the moment I knew they were not just underestimating me, they were planning to use my son. After dinner, Claire walked me to the door. She thanked me for coming, for being so easygoing. She said she admired my simplicity, my contentment with little. I told her contentment was not about how little you have, but about how carefully you protect what matters. She smiled politely, not fully understanding. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the quiet I had built over decades. I thought about Daniel as a boy, counting coins with me at the kitchen table, learning the value of patience, of honesty. I thought about the choices I had made to shield him from desperation, even when it meant others believed we had nothing. And I realized that this was not just about pride. This was about protecting my son from a future shaped by other people's fears. I decided then that I would stop pretending soon. Not abruptly, not cruelly. Truth, when revealed too suddenly, feels like an attack, but when revealed calmly, it feels like a lesson. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Claire's parents invited us all to lunch one afternoon, claiming they had something important to discuss. The restaurant they chose was expensive, the kind where menus have no prices. As we sat down, Claire's father got straight to the point. He spoke of expansion, of temporary setbacks, of how family support could make all the difference. He looked directly at Daniel when he said this, then glanced at me, his expression unreadable. I asked him how long the setback had lasted. He hesitated. I asked what guarantees were in place. He laughed again, that familiar, dismissive sound, and said I worried too much, that life required risk, that trust was the foundation of family. I nodded slowly and said something that changed the air at the table. I said trust was built on transparency, not pressure. I said that risk should never be disguised as opportunity, especially when it involved people you claim to love. Claire's mother shifted in her seat. Daniel straightened. Claire looked at me with confusion, then concern. I reached into my cloth purse and pulled out a folded document. It was nothing dramatic, just a letter, a confirmation, proof of something I had kept private for many years. I placed it on the table, not pushing it toward anyone, simply letting it rest there. I told them calmly that I understood investments, that I understood risk, that I had built stability from nothing once, and I would not allow my son to be used as a solution to someone else's hidden problems. I told them that while I lived simply, it was by choice, not necessity. The silence that followed was heavy. Claire's father stared at the document, then at me. Claire's mother's smile vanished entirely. Daniel looked between us, his face pale, realization dawning slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply said that if they wanted Daniel's partnership, it would be on equal terms, with full disclosure, or not at all. And if they could not respect that, then they would not have access to him or to me. When we left the restaurant, Daniel stopped me on the sidewalk. He asked me why I had never told him, why I had let people believe things that weren't true. I took his face in my hands, the way I used to when he was small, and told him that wealth is not protection, wisdom is, and sometimes letting people underestimate you teaches you exactly who they are before they ever learn who you are. That was not the end of the story. It was only the moment the balance shifted, and in the days that followed, the true cost of that shift became painfully clear. The days after that lunch felt heavier than I expected, not because I regretted what I had done, but because truth, once spoken, has a way of rearranging relationships whether we are ready or not. Daniel was quieter. Not distant, but thoughtful, as if he were revisiting every memory of his childhood with new eyes. Claire, on the other hand, seemed caught between two worlds, unsure which version of her life was real anymore. She came to see me alone a few days later. I could tell she was nervous the moment she stepped into my apartment. She looked around as if seeing it for the first time, noticing details she had overlooked before: the neat shelves, the framed certificates on the wall, the calm order of a life built intentionally. She sat on the edge of the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. She asked me why I had never corrected her parents, why I let them believe I was uneducated, unworldly, small. I told her gently that I did not let them believe anything. They chose what they saw based on what they valued. I told her that people often hear only what confirms their assumptions. Claire's eyes filled with tears then. She admitted that she had grown up believing her parents were always right, always generous, always in control. She said she had never questioned where their confidence came from or what it cost. She confessed that the business troubles were not new, that there had been tension at home for years, whispered arguments behind closed doors. She had married Daniel believing his calm nature would bring stability, not realizing how much her parents expected him to fill the cracks they could no longer hide. I listened without judgment. When she finished, I told her something she did not expect. I told her that loving your parents does not mean carrying their burdens silently, and marrying into a family does not mean inheriting their debts, financial or emotional. That conversation changed something between us. Not everything, but enough. She began to see me not as a simple woman to be pitied, but as someone who had chosen her life carefully, and in that recognition there was respect. Meanwhile, Claire's parents withdrew. Invitations stopped, calls went unanswered. When Daniel reached out, they responded politely but briefly, their warmth replaced by something colder. Pride wounded is not easily soothed. I knew they were struggling to reconcile the image they had constructed of me with the reality they could no longer ignore. One evening, Daniel came to my apartment carrying a folder. Inside were documents Claire's father had finally shared with him after persistent requests: financial statements, loan agreements, evidence of risks far greater than they had admitted. Daniel sat at my table, his head in his hands, overwhelmed. He told me he felt betrayed, not just by them, but by himself, for nearly agreeing to something that could have undone everything he had worked for. I told him that recognizing a mistake before it happens is not failure, it is wisdom arriving just in time. Claire joined us later that night. She looked exhausted, torn by loyalty and truth. She told Daniel that her parents were angry, that they believed I had humiliated them, that they said I had manipulated the situation by hiding who I was. I smiled sadly when she told me this. People often accuse others of deception when they are forced to confront their own deceptions. I asked Claire one simple question. I asked her whether she believed I had ever lied. She shook her head slowly. She said no. I asked her whether her parents had been honest about their intentions. She did not answer right away. That silence was her answer. Over the next weeks, boundaries were drawn. Daniel declined the investment firmly. He told Claire's parents he would support them emotionally, but not financially, and only with full transparency going forward. They did not take it well. Harsh words were spoken. Old guilt was weaponized. Claire cried more than once, caught in the middle of expectations she had never agreed to carry. I stayed present, but I did not interfere. This was their marriage, their test. All I could do was remind them both that love should not require self-destruction. The turning point came unexpectedly. Claire's father fell ill. Not seriously at first, but enough to force him to slow down. Hospital visits have a way of stripping people of their illusions. When Daniel and Claire went to see him, they invited me along. I hesitated, but agreed. In the hospital room, the man who had once spoken so confidently now looked smaller, fragile in a way no wealth could mask. When he saw me, his eyes flickered with something like shame. He asked me to sit. I did. He spoke quietly then. He admitted he had been wrong. Not fully, not eloquently, but enough. He said fear had driven him, fear of losing everything he had built, fear of appearing weak. He said when he saw Daniel, he saw a lifeline, not a son, and when he saw me, he saw someone he assumed would never challenge him. I told him gently that fear makes liars of us all, but it does not have to make us cruel. I told him that respect is not granted by wealth or authority, but by honesty. When we left the hospital, Claire cried in the car, not from sadness, but relief. Something had finally been said out loud. Life did not magically become perfect after that. Relationships take time to heal, and some never fully do. But something important had shifted. Claire's parents became more cautious, more measured. They no longer spoke down to me. They asked questions now, real ones, and when I answered, they listened. Daniel grew stronger, more confident in his boundaries. He stopped apologizing for choosing peace over pressure. And Claire learned that marriage is not about pleasing everyone, but about protecting the life you build together. As for me, I returned to my quiet routines, my sewing, my walks, my evenings of reflection. I did not feel victorious. I felt settled, because the lesson had never been about revealing my worth to others. It had been about reminding my son and myself that dignity does not need an audience. Sometimes the greatest power is allowing people to underestimate you until the moment honesty becomes unavoidable. And when that moment arrives, it speaks louder than any display ever could. After the hospital visit, there was a stretch of uneasy calm. Not peace exactly, but a fragile ceasefire where everyone seemed to be moving carefully, as if afraid one wrong step would shatter what little honesty had finally surfaced. Claire's parents did not suddenly transform into different people. Pride does not dissolve overnight, especially the kind that has been reinforced by years of admiration and control. But something in them had softened, not out of humility, but exhaustion. Daniel noticed it first. He told me that conversations with them felt slower now, less commanding, more uncertain. They asked instead of instructed. They paused instead of pushing. It was subtle, but it mattered. Power, when challenged, often retreats quietly before it returns in a different form, and I remained watchful without being suspicious. Claire came by often during that time. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes she just sat with me in the evenings, watching me sew, asking questions about my life before Daniel. She admitted she had never really thought about who I was beyond the label of Daniel's mother. She had assumed my story was simple because my lifestyle was. I told her that simplicity is rarely the absence of complexity. More often, it is complexity that has learned how to rest. One evening, as the sun dipped low through my window, Claire asked me something I had sensed was coming. She asked me if I had ever felt ashamed of living quietly when others flaunted their success. I stopped sewing and thought carefully before answering. I told her there was a time, long ago, when I believed visibility equaled value, when I thought being seen was the same as being respected. But life had taught me that the loudest people are often trying to outrun their own emptiness. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then she asked me how I had managed to save, to build stability without ever showing it. I told her the truth. I said discipline is easier when you don't need applause, that when you stop trying to prove yourself, you make better decisions, and that privacy is not secrecy, it is protection. That conversation stayed with her. I could see it in the way she began to respond to her parents, less reactive, more grounded. When they hinted at needing help, she asked questions instead of offering reassurance. When they complained about Daniel's refusal to invest, she did not rush to smooth things over. She allowed discomfort to exist, something she had never done before. Not everyone appreciated this change. Claire's mother came to see me one afternoon while Daniel was at work. She arrived with a tight smile and a carefully chosen gift, something expensive and unnecessary. She sat stiffly on my sofa and spoke in a measured tone, telling me how difficult things had been lately, how strained the family felt, how she worried about losing closeness with her daughter. I listened quietly, already sensing where this was headed. She said she felt I had changed things, that before I revealed myself, everything had been simpler, that perhaps I could have handled it differently, softer, more privately. I let her speak without interruption. When she finished, I thanked her for being honest. Then I said something she did not expect. I told her that things had only felt simple because the truth was being avoided, that comfort built on illusion always collapses eventually, and that if her relationship with her daughter depended on everyone pretending, then it was never strong to begin with. Her expression hardened. She said I did not understand what it was like to maintain a family's reputation. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and told her calmly that I had spent my life maintaining something far more difficult than reputation. I had maintained integrity when no one was watching. She left soon after, clearly dissatisfied, but I did not feel shaken. If anything, I felt clearer, because that visit confirmed what I already knew. She was not angry about deception. She was angry about losing control. That night, Daniel called me, troubled. His mother-in-law had spoken to Claire, accusing her of being influenced by me, of turning against her own family. Claire was hurt, confused, angry. Daniel asked me if I thought I should apologize, just to smooth things over. I told him no. I told him that peace purchased with silence is temporary, and the cost is always paid later. I reminded him that marriage is not about choosing sides, but about choosing values, and values, once compromised, do not easily return. A few days later, Claire confronted her parents herself. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply stated that she would not pressure her husband to fix problems he did not create, that she loved them, but she would not allow guilt to dictate her marriage, that honesty, even when uncomfortable, was the only way forward. It was a defining moment, one I could not have orchestrated even if I had tried. Her parents reacted predictably at first, tears, defensiveness, claims of sacrifice. But something was different this time. Claire did not retreat. She did not apologize for setting boundaries. She held her ground with a quiet strength I had never seen in her before. After that, communication slowed. Holidays were tense. Invitations were polite but distant. I knew Claire struggled with the distance, even as she understood its necessity. One evening, she admitted to me that she felt as though she was grieving parents who were still alive. I told her that grief often accompanies growth. You mourn the version of people you thought you had, even as you accept who they truly are. Time passed, months, not days, and with time came perspective. Claire's father's business did not recover the way he hoped. Some losses could not be undone, but without Daniel's involvement, the consequences remained his own. I watched from afar as he adjusted, slowly, reluctantly, to a smaller life, less impressive, more honest. He never said it directly, but I believe part of him knew that had Daniel stepped in, the damage would have been far worse. One afternoon, Daniel surprised me. He told me he wanted to buy a house, not a large one, not in a flashy neighborhood, just a modest place where he and Claire could grow without pressure. He asked for my advice, not my money. That mattered more to me than anything else. As we sat at my table looking over listings, I felt a deep sense of quiet pride, not because I had outsmarted anyone, not because my worth had been revealed, but because my son had learned to trust his own judgment, and because my daughter-in-law had learned that strength does not always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Looking back, I understand now that pretending to be poor and naive was never really an act. It was simply allowing others to reveal themselves without interference. The truth was always there, waiting. All I did was choose the moment to let it speak. And when it did, it reshaped everything.
By the time Daniel and Claire moved into their new house, a full year had passed since that first dinner, where I wore my oldest shoes and lowered my eyes. Life had not settled into something perfect, but it had grown honest, and there is a kind of peace that only honesty brings. The house they chose was small, sunlit, and ordinary in the best way. No grand entrance, no polished gate, just a place that felt like it could hold laughter without demanding performance. I helped them unpack on the first day. Claire insisted I choose where the kitchen table would go, saying I had the best sense for how a home should feel. As we worked, I noticed how different she was now. Not louder, not harder, just steadier. She no longer flinched when the phone rang and her parents' name appeared on the screen. She answered when she wanted to, and when she didn't, she let the call go without guilt. Her parents did visit eventually. The first time was awkward. They arrived with a housewarming gift far more expensive than necessary, as if trying to compensate for something unsaid. Claire's father walked through the room slowly, measuring, assessing, then stopped himself mid-comment more than once. Old habits trying to reassert themselves, then retreating. Claire's mother complimented the home politely, but without enthusiasm. She asked whether they planned to upgrade in a few years. Daniel answered calmly that this was enough for them. I watched closely, ready to intervene if needed, but he held his ground without my help. That was when I knew my role had truly changed. I was no longer the quiet protector standing in the background. I was simply his mother, present but no longer required to shield. After they left, Claire apologized out of habit. I stopped her gently. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. People bring their limitations with them wherever they go. It is not our responsibility to carry those limitations as our own. As time went on, Claire's parents softened further, though never completely. They learned slowly that pressure no longer worked, that emotional leverage had lost its power. They still struggled with pride, but it was tempered now by consequence. They had learned that Daniel was not a resource to be tapped, and I was not a weakness to be exploited. One afternoon, Claire's mother called me directly. That alone told me something had shifted. She asked if we could talk. Her voice lacked its usual edge. I agreed. When she arrived, she did not bring a gift this time. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked tired. Not ill, not frail, just worn. She told me she had been thinking a lot about that lunch, about the moment I placed the document on the table. She said she realized then how easily she had dismissed me, how confident she had been in her assumptions. She did not apologize outright. Instead, she said she wondered how many people she had underestimated in her life because they did not look the way she expected success to look. It was not a perfect admission, but it was honest enough. I accepted it for what it was. I told her something I had never said aloud before. I told her that when Daniel was young, there were nights I went to bed hungry so he could eat well, that I learned early how invisible sacrifice can be when it is done without complaint. I told her that wealth does not teach you how to endure, it teaches you how to avoid discomfort. And endurance, while painful, builds clarity. She listened quietly. When she left, she thanked me. Not politely, genuinely. And though I knew we would never be close, I also knew the hostility had finally dissolved into something neutral. Sometimes neutrality is the most realistic victory. Daniel and Claire settled into their routines. They invited me for Sunday dinners. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes we didn't. One evening, Daniel admitted that he had struggled with anger after everything came to light. Anger at Claire's parents, anger at himself, even anger at me for not telling him sooner. I told him that anger is a sign that you are growing beyond the version of yourself that once accepted less. I told him it was okay to feel it as long as he did not let it harden into bitterness. Claire shared her own struggle. She said she felt as though she was constantly translating herself now, balancing love for her parents with loyalty to her husband. I told her that translation is exhausting when the language on both sides refuses to evolve. I reminded her that she was allowed to rest, that marriage is not a battlefield where you must constantly negotiate peace. As for me, I returned more deeply to my quiet life. I spent more time sewing, volunteering, walking through the market where no one knew my story and no one needed to. Occasionally, I caught myself smiling at the memory of that first dinner, not with resentment, but with a kind of gentle amusement. How easily people reveal themselves when they believe you are insignificant. I realized then that the greatest lesson of all was not about money or deception or pride. It was about perception, about how quickly we reduce others to what we can immediately understand and how dangerous that reduction can be. I had not pretended to be poor and naive to test anyone. I had done it because I knew that my truth did not need defending. It needed timing. And in waiting, I had protected my son from a future built on obligation instead of choice. Now, when I look at Daniel and Claire sitting at their small kitchen table, planning a life that belongs to them, I feel something deeper than pride. I feel relief. Relief that the cycle of quiet manipulation ended with me. Relief that my son learned strength without arrogance. Relief that my daughter-in-law learned boundaries without cruelty. If there is a moral in all of this, it is simple. Never underestimate the quiet ones, never assume humility means ignorance, and never mistake silence for consent. Some of us are simply listening, waiting, and choosing the right moment to let the truth speak for itself. Because when it does, it has a way of setting everyone free, whether they are ready for it or not.
As the seasons changed, I noticed something subtle but important happening within myself. For years, I had lived with a quiet vigilance, always watching for the moment when I might need to step in, to protect, to correct a course before it drifted too far. That vigilance had shaped me as much as motherhood itself. But now, slowly, it began to loosen. Not disappear, but soften. I was no longer standing guard at the edge of Daniel's life. I was walking alongside it, trusting that he could see the path clearly on his own. That realization came one afternoon when Daniel called to tell me he and Claire were thinking about starting a family. He said it casually, almost shyly, as if afraid of disturbing something delicate. I felt my breath catch for just a moment, not from fear, but from the weight of time pressing gently against memory. I remembered holding him for the first time, promising silently that I would give him a life free from the kind of uncertainty that had shaped my own childhood. I told him I was happy for them, truly happy. And as I said it, I realized there was no lingering worry beneath my words, no silent calculation of what could go wrong. That, more than anything else, told me how much had changed. Claire grew closer to me during that time, not in a dependent way, but with a quiet respect that felt earned on both sides. She asked questions about pregnancy, about balance, about how to remain yourself when everyone suddenly has expectations of who you should become. I told her the truth, that motherhood amplifies everything you already are, that the strongest thing you can give a child is not perfection, but consistency, and that boundaries are not walls. They are doors you choose when and how to open. Her parents reacted to the news with mixed emotions. Joy, certainly, but also anxiety. The prospect of a grandchild seemed to awaken their old instincts to control, to plan, to advise excessively. But this time, Daniel and Claire were ready. They listened politely, they accepted what felt helpful and declined what didn't without explanation or apology. I watched from a distance, proud not because they mirrored my choices, but because they made their own. One evening, Claire's father called me unexpectedly. His voice was quieter than I remembered, less assured. He asked if he could come by.
When he arrived, he did not sit immediately. He stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the street below. Finally, he spoke. He told me he had been thinking a lot about power, about how easily it slips away when it is built on fear instead of trust. He admitted that losing control over Daniel's decisions had frightened him more than any financial loss. He said he had mistaken authority for love and provision for entitlement. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I told him something I had learned the hard way. I told him that children do not owe their parents a return on investment, that love given with conditions eventually becomes a debt no one can repay, and that if he wanted a place in his grandchild's life, it would need to be built on respect, not expectation. He nodded slowly. I could see the effort it took for him to accept that truth. Change is hardest for those who have spent a lifetime believing they were right. After he left, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about how differently that conversation might have gone if I had revealed myself sooner, louder, more forcefully. I realized then that timing had been everything. Had I confronted them early, they would have defended their pride. Had I stayed silent forever, my son would have paid the price. Instead, the truth had arrived when it could no longer be dismissed as arrogance or attack. It arrived as inevitability. As the months passed, I watched Daniel and Claire prepare for parenthood. They argued gently about names, laughed over small purchases, worried about things that mattered, and learned to let go of things that didn't. Their home filled with anticipation rather than pressure, and I felt something inside me finally rest. People sometimes ask me now why I never corrected those first assumptions, why I let myself be seen as poor and naive. They ask as if it were a strategy, a clever plan. I tell them it was neither. It was simply restraint, the understanding that not every truth needs to be defended immediately. Some truths need space to grow teeth before they can bite through illusion. I also learned something about myself through all of this. I learned that my worth was never tied to recognition, that my quiet life was not a placeholder for something greater, but a deliberate choice shaped by experience, and that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, listens, and steps forward only when it must. The day Claire told me she was pregnant, she cried in my arms, not from fear, but from gratitude. She said she was thankful her child would grow up seeing boundaries modeled with kindness and humility practiced with confidence. I held her and thought about the strange, winding path that it led us here, about how pretending to be less had revealed so much more. If there is one truth I hope lingers after this story, it is this: never rush to prove who you are to those who have already decided who you must be. Let them speak. Let them show you their values, and when the moment comes, let your truth stand calmly on its own. It will be enough.
The pregnancy changed the rhythm of everything, but not in the way most people expect. There was no sudden chaos, no dramatic shift in personalities. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, as if everyone involved had been given a reason to slow down and reassess what truly mattered. I watched Daniel become more thoughtful, more present. I watched Claire grow into a steadiness that no longer sought approval, only alignment. Claire's parents hovered at first, not aggressively but anxiously. They offered advice constantly, sometimes helpful, sometimes intrusive. But each time they crossed a line, Daniel and Claire responded the same way: calm, united, firm. No raised voices, no long explanations, just clear decisions. Watching them, I realized that boundaries are most effective when they are boring. When there is no drama to feed on, manipulation starves. Claire's mother struggled the most. She wanted to be involved in everything, from doctor visits to nursery colors. When Claire gently declined, she took it personally. She called me one evening, her voice tight, asking if I thought Claire was pushing her away. I chose my words carefully. I told her that closeness built on permission lasts longer than closeness built on obligation. I reminded her that becoming a grandmother did not mean reclaiming motherhood. It meant learning a new role. She was quiet after that, not offended, just contemplative.
For the first time, I sensed she was listening rather than preparing a response. As for me, I found myself reflecting more on my own journey into motherhood, on the fear I had carried silently, on the loneliness I had masked with routine. I never regretted raising Daniel alone, but there were moments, especially now, when memory softened into tenderness. I began writing again, something I had not done in years. Small reflections, lessons learned too late to apply to myself, but just in time to pass on. One afternoon, Daniel asked me if I would consider moving closer to them once the baby arrived. Not into their home, he clarified quickly, but nearby, close enough to help, far enough to keep everyone sane. I smiled at his thoughtfulness. I told him I would consider it. The truth was, I liked my independence, but I also liked the idea of being present without being central. Around this time, something unexpected happened. Claire's father invited Daniel and me to lunch, just the two of us, no agenda announced. Daniel was hesitant, but I encouraged him to go, not because I trusted his intentions completely, but because avoidance rarely heals what honesty can. When we arrived, the tone was different from before. There was no grand setting, no attempt to impress, just a quiet cafe. Claire's father spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He thanked Daniel for standing firm. He said it had forced him to confront things he had avoided for years. He admitted that his fear of failure had driven him to treat people like solutions instead of individuals. He looked at me then and said something I never expected to hear. He said he admired my restraint, that had I humiliated him publicly, he would have retreated into anger, but my calm refusal had left him nowhere to hide from himself. He said that was harder to forgive, but impossible to deny. I accepted his words without celebration. Acknowledgement is not a trophy, it is simply a step forward. As the due date approached, the family settled into a cautious harmony, not perfect, not effortless, but real, the kind built slowly, with awareness instead of assumption. Claire's parents learned to ask before offering. Daniel learned to trust his instincts. Claire learned she could be loving without being accommodating. And I learned that my role was evolving again. The day the baby was born, Daniel called me first. His voice trembled as he told me it was a girl. I sat down, suddenly aware of my own breath, my own heartbeat. A granddaughter, a new beginning. When I held her later that day, wrapped in a soft blanket, I felt a profound sense of continuity, not ownership, connection. Claire watched me carefully as I held her daughter. I could see relief in her eyes, relief that I did not take over, relief that I did not assert. I simply held the child with quiet reverence, understanding that every generation deserves its own space to become. In the weeks that followed, I helped where asked. I cooked meals, I folded laundry, I rocked the baby when Claire needed rest, and when I was not needed, I left. No guilt, no commentary, just respect. I saw how this balance strengthened their confidence as parents. Claire's mother struggled again during this time, watching from the edges, unsure where she fit. One afternoon, she asked me how I knew when to step back. I told her stepping back was not abandonment, it was trust, and trust, once given, often returns in ways control never can. She nodded slowly. I could tell she was trying to learn a new language late in life. As I look back now, I see how easily this story could have gone differently, how a single moment of defensiveness or pride could have hardened everything. But I also see how powerful patience can be, how allowing others to underestimate you can become an unexpected shield, revealing intentions without confrontation. I did not pretend to be poor and naive to win. I did it to observe, to understand, to protect. And in doing so, I preserved something far more valuable than status or control. I preserved trust. Watching my granddaughter sleep in her mother's arms, I know the cycle has shifted. She will grow up seeing strength modeled quietly, boundaries honored gently, and humility worn not as weakness, but as wisdom. And that, to me, is the truest form of wealth. As my granddaughter grew, so did my understanding of what it means to truly step back, not retreat, not disappear, but reposition.
I visited often but never announced myself. I waited to be invited, and when I was, I came fully present. I noticed how Claire relaxed more when she knew she would not be judged or corrected, how Daniel spoke more openly when advice was offered only after he asked for it. Respect, I learned, is not passive, it is practiced. The baby brought with her a new kind of mirror for everyone. Claire's parents softened further in her presence. Watching them hold their granddaughter was like watching ice thaw slowly under the sun. They still struggled with old habits, but now there was a tenderness that had been missing before. The need to control gave way, at least sometimes, to the desire to connect. One afternoon, Claire's mother sat beside me while the baby slept. She asked me how I had managed not to interfere, not to impose my will when Daniel was small. I told her the truth. I said there were times I wanted to, times I believed I knew best, but I had learned early that children do not thrive under constant correction. They thrive under consistent support. I told her that restraint is not the absence of love, it is its refinement. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said she realized she had spent most of her life confusing involvement with importance, that being needed had felt like proof of her value, and now learning to be wanted instead felt unfamiliar, almost frightening. I told her that fear is often the doorway to growth, that when we stop being indispensable, we begin to be authentic. Over time, Claire's parents began to show up differently, not perfectly, but better. They asked before visiting. They offered help instead of direction. They listened more than they spoke. I watched these changes without commentary. Growth does not need applause. It needs space. One evening, Daniel and Claire invited everyone over for dinner. It was the first time all of us sat around the same table without tension humming beneath the surface. Conversation flowed naturally. The baby slept peacefully nearby. Claire's father asked me about my sewing, genuinely curious. Claire's mother asked how I had learned to live with so little worry. I smiled at that. I told her worry never leaves. You simply learn which voices deserve your attention. As the evening wound down, Claire stood up, lifted her glass, and said something that surprised us all. She thanked both sets of parents. She thanked her parents for giving her opportunities, and she thanked me for giving Daniel the ability to stand on his own. She said she was grateful to raise her daughter surrounded by people who were still willing to learn. There were tears that night, not from pain, but release. Later, as I walked home alone under the streetlights, I thought about how close this family had come to fracturing under the weight of assumption and pride, how easily I could have been dismissed entirely, or how easily I could have lashed out and created permanent division. Instead, patience had allowed truth to surface without violence. People often think strength must be loud to be effective, but I have learned that quiet strength unsettles more deeply. It leaves room for others to confront themselves without the distraction of defending against you. I never told Claire's parents everything. I never listed my achievements or spoke of the choices that had built my security, not because I was hiding, but because it was no longer necessary. They had learned to respect me without credentials, and that respect, once earned, was more durable than any explanation. As my granddaughter took her first steps, wobbling and uncertain, I saw the metaphor clearly. Growth requires space to stumble, support without interference, trust without surveillance, and I realized that the lesson I had lived through was not just for them, it was for me as well. Letting go is not something you do once, it is something you practice again and again in small ways every day, and each time you choose restraint over control, you teach the people you love how to stand on their own. Looking back, I see that pretending to be poor and naive was never about lowering myself. It was about removing the noise so I could see clearly. It allowed me to witness character unfiltered by performance, and in doing so, it guided me toward the right moments to speak and the wisdom to remain silent when silence was more powerful. Now, as I sit in my quiet apartment, sunlight warming the floor, I feel complete. Not because everything turned out perfectly, but because it turned out honestly. My son is secure, my daughter-in-law is strong, my granddaughter is surrounded by love that does not suffocate. If there is one thing I would tell anyone listening to this story, it is this. Do not rush to correct others' assumptions about you. Sometimes those assumptions are the very thing that reveal who they really are. And once you see that, you can choose your response with clarity instead of emotion. That choice changes everything. As the years moved forward, life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than forced. My granddaughter grew from a bundle and a blanket into a curious little girl with steady eyes and a quiet confidence that reminded me so much of Daniel at that age. Watching her, I often thought about how much of who we become is shaped not by what we are told, but by what we observe. Children absorb tone. They notice how adults listen to one another, how disagreements are handled, how respect is shown even in moments of tension. Claire's parents continued their slow evolution. They never became entirely different people, but they became more aware. Awareness, I have learned, is often the highest form of change available to adults. They began asking me about my life in ways that felt genuine rather than curious. They stopped offering advice unless asked, and when they did offer it, they accepted refusal without offense. One afternoon, Claire's mother admitted something to me while we sat watching my granddaughter play on the floor. She said she used to believe authority was something you claimed by being the most informed, the most vocal, the most decisive. Now, she said, she saw that authority can also come from consistency and calm. She told me she was still learning to sit with uncertainty instead of trying to manage it away. I told her learning rarely feels comfortable, and if it does, it probably isn't deep enough. Daniel thrived in this new environment. Free from the pressure to perform for anyone but himself, he took risks that were thoughtful rather than desperate. He changed roles at work, choosing something that aligned better with his values instead of chasing status. He spoke with confidence, but also with humility, and when he struggled, he asked for help without shame. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, he thanked me, not for the money he now knew I had saved or for the protection I had offered, but for the patience I had practiced. He said that watching me remain calm in the face of dismissal had taught him more about strength than any lecture ever could. I listened quietly, my heart full, knowing that this was the reward that mattered. Claire, too, found her footing. She returned to work part-time, balancing motherhood with a sense of self she had nearly lost while trying to meet everyone else's expectations. She told me she finally understood that pleasing others was not the same as being valued, that love built on compliance erodes quietly over time. As for me, I found joy in small, steady things. Morning walks, handwritten notes, teaching my granddaughter how to thread a needle when she was old enough to sit still. I lived with intention, no longer carrying the weight of anticipation or defense. The world no longer felt like something I needed to navigate carefully. It felt like something I could meet honestly. Occasionally, someone new would enter the family orbit, a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, and sometimes they would underestimate me, too. They would see the modest clothes, the quiet demeanor, the unassuming habits, and I would smile inwardly, not with amusement or superiority, but with understanding. Everyone sees through the lens they were given. It is not my job to adjust it for them. The final turning point came unexpectedly at a family gathering years later. Claire's father stood up to speak, unprompted. He spoke about family, about learning, about how pride can blind even the most well-intentioned people. He did not name names, he did not revisit the past in detail, but he looked at me as he spoke, and in that look there was acknowledgement, not debt, not guilt, recognition. Afterward, he approached me quietly and said, "You taught us something without trying to teach us." I nodded and said that the best lessons are often unintentional. As the evening ended and people began to leave, I stayed behind to help Claire clean up. She hugged me suddenly, tightly, and whispered, "Thank you." I asked her for what. She said for showing her that strength does not need to announce itself, that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to be provoked. Walking home that night, I reflected on the strange beauty of this journey, on how pretending to be poor and naive had never been about deception. It had been about observation, about letting others reveal their values before revealing mine. It had allowed me to choose response over reaction, wisdom over impulse. I realized then that the story was complete, not because there was nothing left to learn, but because the lesson had taken root in everyone who mattered. The cycle of judgment had been interrupted, the habit of underestimation had been exposed, and the family had learned to relate not through hierarchy, but through mutual respect. If you are listening to this and find yourself underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, I want you to remember this. You do not owe anyone an explanation of your worth. You do not need to rush to prove yourself to those who have already decided who you are. Let time do some of that work for you. Let silence speak when words would only inflame. And when you do choose to speak, let it be with clarity and calm. Because true power is not in being seen, it is in being understood. And understanding often arrives quietly long after the noise has faded. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet of my home, years removed from that first dinner where I wore my oldest shoes and spoke softly on purpose, I understand something I could not have named back then. That evening was never about pretending to be poor or naive. It was about choosing observation over reaction. It was about trusting myself enough to wait. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges, not by force, but by repetition. Repeated choices, repeated restraint, repeated honesty. When I look at my family now, I see people who are no longer performing for one another. Daniel no longer measures himself against invisible expectations. Claire no longer carries the weight of being the bridge between two worlds. Her parents no longer assume that authority comes from being the loudest voice in the room. And me? I no longer feel the need to protect by concealment. That season has passed. My granddaughter is older now. She asks questions that stop adults mid-sentence. Questions like why people argue when they love each other, or why some homes feel heavy and others feel light. I answer her simply. I tell her that love grows best where people listen more than they speak, and where no one is afraid to be themselves. I tell her that kindness is strongest when it is quiet. Sometimes when she visits my apartment, she opens drawers and cabinets, curious about the life I live. She once asked me why I never moved somewhere bigger. I smiled and told her that space is not measured in rooms, but in freedom, that my home fits me because my life fits me. Daniel once told me that for a long time, he thought success meant proving something to people who doubted you. Now he understands that success is choosing peace even when you could choose pride. That realization did not come from any speech I gave him. It came from watching me sit calmly in rooms where I was underestimated and refusing to shrink or shout. Claire told me recently that she no longer feels the urge to explain herself to her parents, that she loves them, but she no longer needs their approval to feel steady. She said that watching me taught her that respect gained through fear is fragile, but respect earned through consistency endures. Claire's parents, in their own way, have changed the most, not because they became softer people, but because they became more honest ones. They learned that control does not guarantee loyalty, and that generosity tied to expectation eventually poisons the very bonds it seeks to strengthen. They learned that people who do not need your approval are not threats, they are mirrors. I have often been asked whether I would do it all the same way again, whether, knowing how painful and tense those moments were, I would still choose silence first. My answer is yes, not because silence is always right, but because in that moment it was wise.
Wisdom is not about following rules. It is about reading the room, the people, the timing, and your own heart. There is a dangerous belief that strength must be immediate, visible, and undeniable, but I have learned that true strength often waits. It waits until speaking will build instead of burn. It waits until truth can land without being weaponized. It waits until the listener is finally capable of hearing. When I placed that document on the table all those years ago, it was not an act of revenge. It was not a reveal meant to shock. It was simply the end of my waiting, the moment when observation had done its work and silence had gathered enough weight to matter. Everything that followed grew from that choice. If you are listening to this and you feel unseen, underestimated, or quietly judged, I want you to know this. You are not obligated to correct every false assumption about you. Some people are not ready for the truth yet, and some truths are better introduced gently when they can no longer be dismissed. Your life does not need an audience to be valid. Your wisdom does not need to announce itself, and your worth does not depend on whether others recognize it quickly or at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe what they want long enough for them to show you who they are before you decide who you will be to them. That choice protected my son. It strengthened my marriage to my own values. It reshaped an entire family dynamic, and it gave my granddaughter a legacy of quiet strength instead of inherited pride. I did not win anything by pretending to be poor and naive. I gained clarity, and clarity, once gained, changes everything. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of moments where silence carried you further than confrontation ever could, then my sharing has served its purpose. May you trust your timing, honor your truth, and remember that humility is not weakness. It is often the deepest form of confidence.